And if you want to see the chat, on that same More button, there's a side menu that right underneath participants is chat. So if you click on that, you'll get a chat window and you'll be able to see all of the chat that's happening.
I don't see a thing that says participant. Is that just because we haven't participants yet?
Well, I can still see it.
Which window are you in, Charlotte?
In the down at the bottom where the all of my controls are.
Do you have the word more?
No, I see it.
Okay.
Yes, and I see I see 12 lovely participants. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to join by chat and just say who you are and where you're from and what your interest is in our webinar, we're going to wait for a few minutes and start our conversation, maybe 3 minutes or so, 3 or 4 minutes. But please, as you're joining us, feel free to share in the chat bar what's going on with you, why you're here, where you're from. We're really happy that you're here today with us. So. Oh, hey, Catherine, down the hall. Stuart, welcome. So you're so welcome here. And if you are, hi, Missy. If you are, if you're not used to Zoom, if you hover down at the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat bubble, and you can click on that and type in, and we will all see what you're saying. The way that we're going to work today is we are going to do some introductions and a little bit of conversation, and then we'll take a break for questions and comments, and I will be reading the chat bar. So if you have questions and comments, please holler, and we'll try to address them. We're so glad that you're here. If you just joined us, we're going to start in just a few minutes. Hi, Lois. Nice to see you. Oh, and you're on your Racial Healing, Justice, and Reconciliation Task Force. That's great. I hope if you have things that you think that we should know about, we'd love to hear it too. Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you. Welcome, Chris. Nice to see you. First Presbyterian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Hello, Michael. Welcome. That's an unusual combination for me to see, the Director of Music and Spiritual Life. That's awesome. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start. Sarah has just said that she thinks that some people are only chatting to the panelists. So if you are in the chat bar down at the very bottom, there's a little to bar, and it says you can there's a caret. You can say send chat to all panelists and attendees, or a specific panelist, although that might be a little complicated. But please, if you're only sending it to the panelists, click on all panelists and attendees so that we can all hear you, see you, read you. Great. Thanks, Catherine, for checking that out. All right, so we're going to begin. Welcome to Wisdom from the Field, our bi-monthly Building Faith webinar. We tentatively called this Beloved Community, and we've had a bunch of other titles, which you'll hear as we go through our conversation. And I'm Charlotte Greason. I am a co-editor of Building Faith. I've been a co-editor since 2014, and I don't normally run the webinars, so this will be a learning experience for me. And welcome, as I said, we are going to do some introductions. I'm going to start by asking the Reverend Liz Miller to introduce herself, and then we'll go through the other panelists. Liz? Oh. Liz, hang on.
You're on mute, Liz.
Liz, you're on mute.
All right. I knew I'd forget that. My name's Reverend Liz Miller. I'm the pastor of Edgewood United Church of Christ. So thank you all for having me, letting me join you today. And we are in East Lansing, Michigan, which is the ancestral and contemporary home and land of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And I include that in my introduction just as an acknowledgement and respect of the history of where I am and the recognition that Indigenous voices are often erased first. I'm here because my congregation is striving to strengthen our commitment to racial justice, and we cannot do this work alone. We are better for having conversation partners and ministry partners out in the field doing this, challenging us, and inspiring us. James, you want to go next?
Sure, thank you, Liz. My name is James McKim, and I am from the town of Goffstown, New Hampshire, which is on the ancestral land of the Pennacook tribe. And I'm here to enter in discussions around racial reconciliation, which is a major focus of the Episcopal Church. And I serve in a number of capacities for the church at the parish level as co-chair of the Racial Reconciliation and Social Justice Committee for St. Matthew's Church in Goffstown, and at the national level as chair of the Executive Council's Committee on Anti-Racism. So happy to be here and entering into conversations and learning with everyone about how to go about doing this important work. And I will now invite Parker to introduce herself.
Cool. Hi, y'all. Can y'all hear me? Can people can hear me? Cool.
Yes.
So my name is Parker Garrett. I'm the Children's, Youth, and Family Ministries Director at St. Mark's in Altadena, California, which is on ancestral land of the Hahamunga peoples. And I'm really excited to be doing this work because I'm also involved in the Beloved Community story sharing movement and initiative as a story weaver. So we have a guidebook with a set of curated tools that I've seen change relationships and change my community both locally, and I've also had the opportunity to share those tools more broadly. And so I'm just excited to be a part of these conversations and learn a bit.
Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much. As I said, I'm Charlotte Greason. I am currently sitting in our Lifelong Learning Hub at Virginia Theological Seminary. We reside on the territorial lands of the Pamunkey tribe, which is something I didn't know, and I really appreciate having another perspective. So thank you, Liz, for bringing it to our awareness that acknowledgement is really important. I thought we could begin with prayer and some scripture. Maybe not quite the normal prayer. It's going to be a reading from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. But the scripture should be familiar to most people. It's from the prophet Amos. And we can read it together if you want, or I can read it, but take a moment, take a deep breath. We'll start with scripture. And the prophet Amos says that the Lord says to him, "Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. made popular the phrase beloved community, which is a phrase that we use in the Episcopal Church. And I found this quote of his that describes this vision of what the beloved community might be. And he writes in 1957, "But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. The type of love that I stress here is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing of love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of men. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization." Powerful words, both from the prophet Amos and from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And I chose this scripture and these words because I think what we're trying to do in all of the work that James and Liz and Parker are doing is to really examine diversity and, in the words of the Story Sharing Initiative, to share faith, to discuss, to have conversations around faith, race, and diversity. And I thought we could begin with some examination of why the three of our panelists believe in this work and why they're doing it a little bit more deeply. So, James, do you want to start a little bit?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So, I'm as Parker is the storyteller and the story weaver. I start off with stories as the reason for doing this work. So one story that's very compelling to me is that on August 8th of 2017, an 8-year-old biracial boy in Claremont, New Hampshire, population 12,855, was happily playing with some teenagers in the park. Somehow, the boy ended up with a rope around his neck, hanging from a tree. He was rushed to the hospital, and later that afternoon, photos of him were posted by his mother with the bruises on his neck. So that's an example of individual racism. And you need to understand that New Hampshire is a state which is 93.7% Caucasian, 2.4% Asian American, 1.9% two or more races, and 1.3% African American. To further that set of statistics, Claremont, where this incident happened, is 98.07% Caucasian, 0.73% African American, and 0.32% Asian American. So with those kinds of numbers, you wonder, how did such overt racism appear in Claremont, New Hampshire? And so we come to what Dr. Jennifer Harvey calls the fog. Racism is this fog that is all around us. It doesn't matter that the parents of the boys who put the noose around this little boy's neck, it doesn't matter that the parents didn't explicitly teach them about it. It's in the air. It's what we've grown up with as a society. So we need to do work to change society, to change individuals, to teach individuals. And that's at the individual level, but we also have a systemic challenge that we're facing. To this day, 18 months later, the Attorney General's office of the state of New Hampshire has not released details about that incident. So Claremont, New Hampshire, and New Hampshire are wondering, when will justice be served? So those are some of the reasons that that I do this work. I think along with our baptismal covenant as Episcopalians, and many faiths have their own covenants and beliefs, but in our faith, our baptismal covenant has two phrases that and two verses that apply to this. And the phrases are, the questions are, will you seek to serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And we all pledge, I will with God's help. And the second verse that applies is, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? And we reply, I will with God's help. So that I'll stop there. That's a bit of why I personally do this work and feel it's so necessary for us in the world.
Thank you so much, James, for sharing that incredibly powerful story and highlighting both individual racism and systemic racism. And I know that Liz in her UCC parish has done some work on how the parish itself recognizes its own bias and its own racism. Liz, will you talk a little bit about that? But how you came to that understanding?
Yeah, from a very broad perspective, the Christian church founded the United States as we know it today. Christian churches set up our institutions, they formed the government, they formed our education centers. We were the folks in power making decisions. Our preachers were in the pulpit shaping policy and attitudes from the very beginning. And because of that, so when we talk about the history of racism in our country, institutional and systemic, and all the laws and policies that we've been working to undo, the Christian church is more than complicit in that. We have a responsibility to fight against that today in whatever ways that we can. So my congregation, 4 years ago, we did an intensive process to discern what is the most pressing social justice issue of our time that we feel called to respond to. And racial justice came to the top of that. So we formed a task force, so like a committee to make sure that this wasn't going to be just a one and done project or something that we checked off the list. And we began attacking it at examining it on ourselves at those different levels that James talked about, at the personal level, at our interpersonal relationships, at the church as an institution and our leadership model, and cultural, what are our values? What are we saying, when we say we like classical music? Well, we mean Western European classical music. What is our cultural values, and what story does that tell to other churches, to our neighbors, to the wider community? And we really focused too on internal change. We were clear that this wasn't about diversifying our church for the sake of new members, but it was about changing our hearts and our practices, because that's what our faith calls us to do.
Thank you so much, Liz. Parker, would you talk a little bit about diversity within your part of California, within the Diocese of Los Angeles, and why you feel that the storytelling initiative is so important, such an important part about that?
Of course, yeah. So I am serving in the Diocese of Los Angeles, which has a lot of diversity within it, which is beautiful. We speak a lot of different languages. There are many cultures represented, and that has been a real gift, but it's also created some interesting challenges in communication. And there are communities within our diocese that would like to grow more deeply in community with one another, and struggle sometimes with the tools to do that. And I also personally I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, so race was something that we talked about a lot, but there was a lot of anxiety, for me at least, around those conversations. And I ended up stumbling upon the story sharing tools and with the story sharing guidebook, and was able to be a part of this project. And what it's given me as someone who works in a parish, and also the hope it's given me some good hope for how our diocese can use this. There are really some good tools to start having those conversations. They're not incredibly, they're not brand new. It's a set of curated, well thought out tools to share our stories with one another. And what I think is so amazing about it is that even communities like my parish, St. Mark's, a lot of people have been here for decades and think that they know each other quite well. But when we use these story sharing tools, they find that there are stories they haven't told one another that are important. And it calls us into a different kind of community and a different kind of awareness, and gives us the beginnings of a way to wrap our arms around the beauty and complications of living in really diverse spaces.
Thank you, Parker. So I think I'm happy to hear, James, Liz, Parker, if you want to say more about why it's so important that Christian churches address racial injustice, the foundational causes of it, what the deeper layer is. And I'm also happy to, if from the viewers, if you have questions or comments, please put them into the chat bar. And Diane, there's a slide coming up next that has resources, and the story sharing initiative is in there. It is beloved. It's part of the Beloved Community Curriculum from the Episcopal Church, and it's in that slide. When we share the whole webinar, those slides will also be there, and they're linked to be downloaded. So thank you.
So there's a quote that I'm trying to remember, and it speaks to what the church is called to do. I'm probably not going to remember, and I'll try to post it later. But in essence, what it says is that the church is called to be the entity that speaks truth to power, because that's what Jesus did. He spoke truth to power. We're also called to be a place where people can come for refuge and come for refreshment from the world and the challenges that we face. And the church is also called to be a place of learning and formation for action, to follow in Jesus's footsteps, because you're not going to get that from the rest of the world. The church is called to be that place where those things can happen. So I think that's a real impetus for us and the church to do this work.
I agree. That idea that we can practice within this community, that we're all headed in the same direction, and we need the practice. We need all the practice we can get. Let me just go quickly to these two questions. Diane, I linked the Episcopal Church story sharing intro in the chat box. And Stuart, in answer to your question, yes, in a couple of days, the webinar will be it is being recorded now. It will be available, and then the slides will be there to click through, and all of our resources and anything else that we gather today during our time together. Oh, Jean Marie, will you talk about that? Oh, we can talk about that just a little bit. Let's hang on. So Jean Mary is asking if we're aware of Coming to the Table, which focuses on Black-white relationships within communities. It asks different stakeholders and individuals within communities that have sometimes are racially charged either history or incident that has happened. In fact, after Charlottesville, after the shooting in after the riot in Charlottesville and after the shooting in Charleston, coming to the table came in and did their work, and it brings people together to have these bounded conversation. And Eric says, recently read the books by Carolyn Hessel, Anxious to Talk About It, Helping White Christians Talk Faithfully About Racism, and Preaching About Racism, A Guide to Faith Leaders. We will put all of these links to these books and whatnot in the in our slides when we're done. Stuart, I know that you raised your hand, and I feel a little silly. I can't find where you raised your hand. What you said. Oh, and Sarah Stonecipher is reminding us, yes, there's a follow-up email as well. Oh, good. Stuart, it was an accident. Great. Perfect. So questions, comments about foundations of racism? Anything else from, so I'm gonna pivot just a little bit, and what Jean Marie's comment about the resource of coming to the table brings up is very similar to the work that Parker is doing and the work that the Episcopal, the body that works on anti-racism within the Episcopal Church, and also the UCC curriculum. All of these together have set up a structure to talk about race and racism and racial justice and diversity. And I'd love to talk a little bit about why we need those structures, not necessarily being told what to talk about or told what we should think, but how the structures make for a safe conversational space. James, can you talk a little bit about the Episcopal Church's anti-racism training and what it does?
So what we've done recently is to put together really a framework that describes what we believe everyone should know when it comes to doing this work of really racial reconciliation. We're looking beyond just being anti-racist. We're looking toward reconciliation. Those are two different things. One is looking backward. Anti-racism is looking at the racism that's happened and is happening and trying to stop it. Reconciliation is about, as the word reconcile means, bringing together of people. So we've put together what we are calling the Racial Reconciliation Training Framework, which describes the concepts that we believe any training should include. What we put together is not a curriculum, it's more of a standard. It's a set of concepts and a rubric that describes what we believe anyone who does this work should know and should be able to do, what the skills are. And storytelling is one of those skills that we talk about as you need in your quiver, in your toolbox if you're going to do this work. So the church is trying to equip people to be trained through whatever training mechanism you might go through. And the church actually has, by canon, that's the laws of the church, that anyone going through the ordination process must have taken anti-racism training and racial reconciliation training. And we have some resolutions that have been passed by our General Convention, which is the leadership body of our church, that indicate that any lay leader or staff person should also have gone through this training and really equipping to do this work. So we're trying to, from the broad level of the church, provide some guidance for people who are at the parish and at the diocesan level to equip their people to do this work and to actually go forth and to do this work. So I think I'll stop there. It's a bit from the Episcopal Church level, and I think we'll probably get into what I'm doing locally in a few minutes, but I'll stop there for
Okay, so a framework, the idea of a framework. And Liz, can you talk a little bit about the UCC? Your, maybe a little bit like a 2-second polity for those of us who don't understand UCC polity, and then what the training is that you've provided as a document. And Stuart, I think that this answers your question about strategies to lead congregations into this work and the fear that arises when we say we're going to do work around race. So go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, the United Church of Christ, we have a congregational polity. So while we have a national structure and conference, and we have regional conferences, every congregation is able to make their own decisions, set their own agendas, so to speak. And our national and regional offices can provide resources. It's not terrible, we're just less hierarchical, but it's sort of everybody for themselves, and we're very fiercely, proudly independent. We have been on a kick of saying we need to work on our interdependence because we've nailed that independent thing. So at our conference level here in Michigan, they offer a 1-day racial justice training. And this is, I'm the lead facilitator for that here in Michigan, and I was trained in the Connecticut conference where it was started by Reverend Davida McAllister. And it's a phenomenal training because it allows participants, it's geared towards either church members, clergy, really it's been done for youth, and it helps people develop a common language. What are shared definitions? So that when you're talking about something you've seen on the news or you've read, you're using the same language and words and know what you're talking about in order to be able to go deeper. That, everybody has their own definition of racism, and you start from there and it can go in a million different directions. So developing a common language and helping people really unpack racism and to begin to describe what they are seeing or hearing or experiencing. So practicing together to name what is going on and to unpack that together. And we use, instead of people's personal stories, we use outside fodder. So we bring in clips from either TV shows or news clips or articles that we look together so that we are unpacking those. We are having those uncomfortable conversations of saying, what is happening? What is going on here? What are the power dynamics? What's at play? And then hopefully equipping and inspiring folks to go back to their congregations and continue these conversations. So it's great because congregations can do it together, but clergy more and more are also being encouraged, in some places required to do this training or a similar training.
Thank you, Liz. So congregations can do the training, but what you just said is that in some places clergy, just clergy together, are being required to do it? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. So because we're regional, each region has their own standards of what, like everybody, it's sort of nationally now, everybody has to do boundary training, but it's only recently that what are the other either cultural competencies or trainings that clergy need to go through before ordination, and then in an ongoing way to be able to equip to lead our congregations.
Thank you. James, Parker, you want to talk about, either one of you need to say anything more about why we need structures and why we need to set aside the space to do this work? Parker?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that I was a bit anxious about, I understood and felt the need to have these conversations, but as a person working in Christian formation, I felt a bit toolless to begin this work. And so having a structure, and for me that came about through these story sharing techniques, that gave me something to start working with. And it really, like, the way it transformed even a community that I thought was quite close and quite progressive was really, it caught me off guard. And I think having that structure, having a way to, like, new tools to get out of the rut of the normal stories we tell was incredibly invaluable. And also the structure provided some safety to start having some tough conversations. We were able to be vulnerable with one another and to see one another more clearly and differently maybe than we had before, but having a set of tools gave us a framework to feel safe and to move within that in a way that felt good. So yeah.
Thank you. I think it seems to be a key piece, not only to have structure, to have something that is not created by an individual or even a committee within your particular area, that it's got a little more buy-in from other people. That seems really important. Liz, I love the idea of using examples that aren't personal, we don't have a personal investment with, and there's so many rich examples in media today, or even from a couple years ago, so we don't have to be quite so topical. That's another way of creating a little bit of distinction and safe space. And the idea that we have this space in which we can be vulnerable and it's safe to ask questions seems to be a really important part of working towards our own understanding of our own racism, our own biases, and how we can, as James so eloquently said, see the face of Jesus in everybody.
If I could pull out a thread of something you just said, Charlotte, and it's that concept of creating a safe space for people to be vulnerable. It's really interesting in working with Eric Law from the Kaleidoscope Institute, and he actually prefers a different approach and phrase than safe space. He prefers the term gracious space. And the reason behind that, and some people have been using the term brave space to indicate that, it's not that we want people to feel safe, that they can be there and not say anything and not participate in the conversation. We want to engage them somehow. But brave space sounds a little harsh as well. So he uses the term gracious space, and the idea is, yes, you want to allow for a space where people feel like they can participate, but this work is not safe. These conversations are not safe. There's angst, there's anxiety, there's tension in them. It's messy, as Van Jones likes to say, and he wrote his book, The Messy Truth. This is messy. So I like to use the term gracious space that encourages people to get involved and not be afraid of ruffling feathers, because we're imperfect. We're gonna ruffle feathers, all of us. We need to be accustomed to that and work through that. And to use a term that Resmaa Menakem uses in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, we need to have clean pain, not dirty pain.
I thank you, James. That was really well said. And one of the things I've learned in doing this work with my congregation is, and with other congregations, is that folks have to be there willing to learn. And we don't like being wrong, and don't want to feel, we go very quickly, especially in conversations around race and racism, to places of shame, and we can get stuck there. So we have to be willing to be wrong, and know we're not going to be perfect. And as leaders, as a pastor or a discussion leader in a congregation, you have to know that there are going to be some painful moments, and to be willing as a leader to sit with those and name those, because we also have a responsibility. If something is said that is inappropriate or racist or violent in some way, when we leave that in the space and make it safe for whoever said it rather than addressing it, we're actually doing more violence and harm, which is the opposite of our goals. So I've found as a local church pastor, even though I go to other congregations and do this training, I've brought in other people to lead this work in my congregation. I've only been here 3 years, and especially as we were just getting to know each other, I said, I'm not sure I'm the person that you need to hear from, or that is comfortable enough with you all, or we have enough trust together to lead these conversations. So I said, who locally is also doing this work and can lead a discussion or be a speaker, because sometimes that distance is helpful to hold each other accountable.
Thank you, Liz. Stuart, I think that answers part of that's the very first step in your question about how to lead your congregation or any group of people into these conversations is graciousness, which is a fabulous word, but also trust that the person who's leading you is the appropriate person, and that your faith leaders themselves are going to be there and show up and be present. And I'm just going to go back quickly to what Liz just said about safe space, not to harp on the word, but when we walk away from something that makes us uncomfortable, that doesn't fix anybody's problems, or it just festers. So I just want to pull that back out again. Are there questions from the audience right now? Anything else? We're not leaving. I wanted to get into a little bit of what James and Liz and Parker are doing in particular in their communities, and how they're engaging both their church communities and their wider communities in addressing racial injustice. So if there's no other questions so far, James, can you talk about what you're doing in Goffstown and how it's going?
Sure.
A little bit?
Sure. And I was just thinking maybe we can put up the page that we have that shows the program, but we are engaging in a series of conversations and events over Lent. And those conversations and events are structured using the Episcopal Church's Becoming Beloved Community long-term commitment framework that starts with telling the truth about our history and how we as a church have dealt with race. It continues with proclaiming the dream of how we would like for things to be, what we believe beloved community actually is. Once we've established that kind of vision, we continue with practicing the way of love. How do we practice the way of love? And looking at ways to practice that. And I don't want to say ending, but the last area is repairing the breach, the divisions that we have. So the Episcopal Church has designed this framework for us to move toward becoming beloved community. And here in Goffstown, we've taken that and identified a number of books and events. We're having a number of book reads, starting off with Debbie Irving's Waking Up White, and having we've got churches that are having book discussions around that book. We have our public library involved, having book discussions around that book. And then we're having a community conversation around telling the truth about who we are. And we have some other events going on too. Like we have a Freedom Songs event. We have art gallery exhibits going on. And then we're following that up with the Proclaiming the Dream, where we're reading Martin Luther King's speech that he gave at the 1963 March. And also we're having folks to read the Joseph Barnes book, Understanding Racism, Understanding and Dismantling Racism, and we're having a community conversation around that. Then we're going to go to proclaiming the dream. Go to practicing the way, where we'll be reading Resma Menachem's My Grandmother's Hands, and having a conversation about how do we practice the way of love, and finishing up with reading the book Color of Law, and how institutionalized racism has taken root, and then having a discussion around that book and how, and identifying what systems and institutions locally need to be changed to repair the breach. So that's the overall program. It's sponsored by St. Matthew's Church in Goffstown. We have funding from the Episcopal Diocese. We have the Public Library as a sponsor. We have the NAACP as a sponsor. We have a group called the Granite State Organizing Project as a sponsor. We're getting involved, the school district, and so it's and as well as our local college, St. Anselm College, is involved. So a real community committee has put this together, and we're going through Lent with these conversations, with these events, to have the conversations, hopefully starting off each event with setting some ground rules for the discussions to get back to Stuart's question about how do you do this. Some ground rules for the discussion that make sure that the space that's involved is a gracious space, and hopefully preventing the tensions, or preventing people from feeling that they can't really participate. So a lot of work, a lot of great work going on there, encompassing a lot of different organizations from different perspectives.
James, I'm curious how long it took to set this up. When did you start?
We started this effort back in July of last year, and we've had our first series of book discussions actually last week, and just some great discussions that have been happening. We're having our next event. There's Abby Hutchinson's Freedom Songs concert, which is happening on the 19th. So it really took us that long to really pull things together, and we're not done yet, because we're not at all of the March, April, and May events yet, and we're still doing some planning around those. But so really, initial idea to first event took from July to February 1st.
And I just want to, obviously James didn't say this in his introduction, but James is a well-known person within his community. I'm sure that people, when you said, I'd like to do this, they knew who you were. You weren't coming, from some other place, putting yourself into the community. You're a well-known part of your community. I think that that's important to note, that this does take, while maybe the heavy work of individual examination requires somebody from the outside to facilitate that conversation. When we want to create change within our communities, it helps to be an invested and engaged person from that community.
Absolutely, and we recognize that, and we are actually, as I'm putting this all together, I've been asked by our diocese and by others to create a generic model of this series that can be leveraged and used in other places. So you can stay tuned for that if what I've described is of interest to you.
Stuart, I think that answers your question. I also, James's email is on one of the slides that I flipped through very quickly. So hopefully James won't mind being inundated with emails, but also there should be some framework at some point that comes out of it that enables people to share without exhausting one person from continually resharing, which is sort of the purpose of this webinar. We want to gather people together and then share that information so that we're not constantly repeating ourselves. Parker, do you want to talk a little bit about how story sharing, you think it's changing your community, changing either the larger community or St. Mark's Altadena?
Yeah, for sure. So so I've been doing this work for coming up on a year now, and since I have been trained as a story weaver and have started using these tools within my own parish, people seem to be having conversations a bit differently. And I love that. I love the idea of using the word gracious space. I think I'm going to start using that as well. But we have created a space that is braver and more gracious to wrestle with conflict and to wrestle with tension. And so we've been doing that with adults, and I actually also lead the youth group. So for Lent this year, we'll be taking those tools into youth group. One of the things that Hershey Millette Stevens, who wrote the guidebook, talks about is that our stories talk about God. So we are going to take that lens of like learning about one another to learn more about God, and then consider whose stories we aren't hearing in our community, and who's, how we can honor one another's stories and grow to sort of hold tension in a more active way and create change. And then also on the diocesan level, we have recently received a grant to, the guidebook is already translated into Spanish, but we've received a grant to get the guidebook translated into Mandarin and Korean, which are languages spoken in our diocese. And so we're working on that. And then once that is complete, we'll be taking these tools and starting to pilot some bilingual and multilingual story sharing circles and story sharing spaces to see how we can use these tools in settings where people speak different languages. So that's something to be looking out for.
Thank you. Thanks, Parker. Liz, will you talk about what you do within Edgewood UCC, the particular things that you have asked or your congregation has decided to be engaged in as you travel down this road towards racial awareness, racial justice?
This has been such a major theme in our congregation that it feels like we've done a little bit of everything. And over the past few years, so book discussions and movies and trainings and preaching. But a couple of examples of some things that I really think were successful is we very actively in an ongoing way have been promoting local events that are already happening in our community, that both educational events, speakers, panels, or sometimes it's, hey, did you guys know if Beale Street Could Talk is playing at our local movie theater? So highlighting especially African-American voices or things, communities, events that are happening. We have a fabulous Juneteenth celebration in our community. So encouraging folks to go, sometimes seeing it in the church bulletin and knowing, oh, maybe I'll know someone there, might get someone thinking about attending an event they wouldn't otherwise. We're in a university town, so there's a lot of speakers that come through. 2 years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates came and spoke, so we did a book discussion a month before in our congregation, encouraged people to get tickets and hear him speak, and then that evening partnered with another church to hold a discussion at a local coffee shop so people could process, his talk and what they'd heard and what they were feeling. We also did a really fabulous audit of our children's library in our classrooms, where we went in and looked at, we are formed in the 1950s and have been collecting children's storybooks and picture books ever since then. So we went through and looked with a discerning eye at what are the cultural values that our books are teaching our children, and what colors are all these Bible characters. Jesus is really pale, and clean. We're very intentional, cleaned that out and said we would much rather have a curated library rather than it be a dumping ground for folks. And then said, what are the stories that are missing? And and did sponsor a book. So we had some seed money, purchased a lot of books, and invited congregation members to make a donation, sort of buy the book in honor of someone or in memory of someone, to grow our library with resources that had been missing. So we looked especially for diverse voices and stories, not just historically, because we noticed at one point we were getting a lot of stories from long ago, but stories from today that feature people of all different races and cultural backgrounds. So that was kind of fun, and so it doesn't always have to be scary. You know, we love children's books, and we've featured some of them in worship during our children's time to draw attention to that evolving ministry. And we've also just, in some small ways, incorporated racial justice work in the things we already do. We have a monthly book group that reads a novel together every month. So challenging them to bring in voices of color from their authors that they're choosing from each year, to really look at what books they're drawing from. We have a monthly movie night. So again, you know, just making sure there's some diverse offerings that we're doing. Our congregation gives quite a bit of money each year to different local and global organizations that we choose from. So we set a goal to increase up, I think we're at 30% now of those organizations to do direct racial justice and anti-racism work as part of their goals, to increase to awareness of who are we giving money to and what types of ministries are we supporting. So.
Thank you, Liz. I love hearing what you're doing. It sounds both challenging and fun, and just I guess that's the gift of being both in a university town, but also having a little more flexibility with what you're teaching. Anyway, I love hearing about it. Oh wait, hold on. So James just wrote that they did a webcast on their Courageous Community Conversations, and he linked to it on YouTube. So there's more about James's Goffstown initiative. We are just a few minutes before 4 o'clock. Our time was supposed to be at 4. If you want to stay for a few minutes, Michael Barrows brought up, from San Jose, California, brought up a slightly different question about race and racism and what that looks like in terms of voting and our political landscape. But that is a slightly different topic, and we might just want to gather a different group of people to talk about that. But I do want to raise if there's any other questions, if you guys need if the people watching have anything else to say, questions, comments. As I said, this is recorded and it will be re-listenable, and the slides will all be available on our websites and various places, along with the list of all of our resources, plus the resources that you have raised with appropriate links. And Leslie says the Brookings Institute is doing a webcast about race and voting this week. Thank you, Leslie. That's super helpful. I'll look for it and find the link.
I can also add that I did mention, but I'm also chair of our provinces, which is our regional our New England region task force on multicultural awareness and cultural competency, and we host a monthly webcast, and one of those webcasts is one I posted, but we did another webcast just after the 2016 election on politics and faith. So hearing the question about the political climate and how we need to deal with that made me think of, we did do an episode of that might be interesting for folks to watch.
Thank you. Anything else as we wrap up this part of our conversation and maybe move to a different topic? Liz, Parker, do you want to say anything else as we depart?
I saw a comment from Michael Burrows about, there's also a socioeconomic dimension, and those going hand in hand. And I do think when you're embarking on this work, the intersectionality of identities and realities is part of that ongoing conversation. And so you're having a conversation about race and socioeconomic status and immigration and abilities and disabilities and LGBT rights. Like it goes on and on and on. And so just, once you dip your toe in, it sort of ripples out, which is a good thing and a challenging thing and just important to be aware of.
I would say that in light of that, if it feels overwhelming, the wonderful thing about being a member of a Christian community is that we get to say that we are Christians and we have something that really grounds us and focuses us and is our core identity. And if you look at the world from your core identity, you start to make sense a little bit more and not be pulled in so many directions. It seems to make sense to focus on seeing the face of Jesus in all people and respecting the dignity of all human beings. Parker, last comments?
The only thing is just that if the Beloved Community story sharing tools seem like something that you would like to use in your community, the whole guidebook is free and available online, but also we're a diverse group of story weavers from all over the country, and we are happy to come to you, and if having somebody from the outside come in is helpful in equipping and tooling you to use these resources. So there's an email address that's on the website, and you can find us, and if that feels like something that's helpful, and also if you use the tools, let us know like how it went, because we're hoping to gather some stories about that moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you all. If I'm going to stop recording, I invite you to come back to our webinar next month, which is Gathering Community Online. And then in April, we'll be talking about inclusive church, how we can be a house of prayer for all people. And if you want to stay around and talk for a few minutes, that would be lovely. I invite you all to go and love and serve the Lord. And thank you for being with us.
Thanks.